Okay, this is a lecture about all art, but as Bruno Latour said, all art was once new, and it will take the form of a, to begin with, a detective story really, except that there's more than one denouement. I've been encouraged to submit this paper to the British Journal of Aesthetics, but it's not yet there yet. It's particularly lacking a section on Kant and the English Romantics. Since it's 200 words over length, I'd better rattle through this. In his review of Wilson's landscape at the British Institution for the Champion of 17th July 1814, William Hazlitt, the English art critic, awards the prize for the exhibition to Apollo and the Seasons and Phaeton, two of Wilson's Italianate landscapes in the manner of Claude. Quote, "In the first there is the cool freshness of a misty spring morning. The sky, the water, the dim horizon all convey the same feeling. The fine grey tone and varying outline of the hills, the graceful form of the retiring lake, broken still more by the hazy shadows of the objects that repose on its bosom, the light trees that expand their branches in the air, and the dark stone figure and mouldering temple that strongly contrast with the broad clear light of the rising day, give a charm, a truth, a force and harmony to this landscape which produce the greater pleasure the longer it is dwelt on." Unquote. The syntax reenacts the progress of the eye over the variegated bands of landscape scenery to the bright horizon, where it rebounds upon tonal contrast back to the foreground, an interaction later credited to Claude's endless airy space, where the eye wanders at liberty under the open sky, explores distant objects and returns back as from a delightful journey. Before moving on to Phaeton, the description of Apollo ends with a striking analogy separated by a dash from what precedes, and this is the mystery in the detective story. Quote, "The distribution of light and shade resembles the effect of light on a globe." The analogy seems to bear no relation to the preceding spatial interaction, yet it seems to invoke a larger principle left undeveloped in a mere newspaper review. One possibility is that Hazlitt's analogy refers to a geographical globe of the kind dimly lit by candles that was a common feature of British intellectual life. It would therefore grant an air of totality to the composition that transcends its Arcadian setting. In doing so, it would reverse the contraction of scale in the essay on Going on a Journey that illustrates the poverty of understanding compared to experience in Hazlitt's view. Quote, "What is the true signification of that immense mass of territory and population known by the name of China to us? An inch of pasteboard on a wooden globe, of no more account than a China orange. Things near us are seen of the size of life. Things at a distance are diminished to the size of the understanding." Unquote. Since the globe analogy enlarges rather than diminishes the experience of Wilson's space, it grants the Arcadian scene a macrocosmic reach and global scale that implicitly includes the rest of the world. On the other hand, perhaps it has a microcosmic role in furnishing a momentary insight into the internal mechanism of perception that had preoccupied Hazlitt in his lecture series on British philosophy 2 years earlier. There the figure of the globe appears in a quotation from Locke's essay concerning human understanding, where perception is likened significantly to painting. When we set before our eyes a round globe of any uniform colour, it is certain that the idea thereby imprinted in our mind is of a flat circle variously shadowed with several degrees of light and brightness coming to our eyes. But we, having by use been accustomed to perceive what alterations are made in the reflections of light by the difference of the sensible figures of bodies, the judgment, presently, by an habitual custom, alters the appearance into their causes, so that it frames to itself the perception of a convex figure and an uniform colour, when the idea we receive from thence is only a plane variously coloured, as is evident in painting. Locke means that if we did not bring our habitual memory of touching a globe to our visual image of it, we would see it only as a flat circle on our retinas. Hazlitt proceeded to quote Locke's discussion of Molyneux's question as it came to be known. Locke's friend, the scientist William Molyneux, had posed the question of whether a blind man newly restored to sight would be able to distinguish between a sphere and a cube without resorting to touch, the only faculty through which he could be assumed to have prior knowledge of their differences. Locke agrees with Molyneux that the newly sighted blind man would be unable to tell a sphere apart from a cube without the assistance of touch, for otherwise there would have to be assumed to exist between the separate ideas of sight and touch, an innate correspondence to which, as empirical philosophers, they were implacably opposed. If we take Hazlitt's recognition of the globe as a passing reference to this controversy, a tight fit emerges with the preceding description. Hazlitt interacted with the pictorial space of Apollo and the Seasons through intense images of synesthesia that he elsewhere called gusto, where the impression made on one sense excites by affinity those of another. There is gusto in the recession of the lake, the expansion of the boughs, the mouldering of the temple, and all the cool freshness of a misty spring morning. And these observations are inseparable from an awareness of the artist's technique, so that the tone and outline of the hills and the graceful form of the lake seamlessly combine the vocabularies of nature in painting. The retiring lake, broken still more by the hazy shadows, illustrates the alternation and merging of the painter's observations and actions as he resolves general appearances into finer detail. In the light of Locke's passage, we understand that the purpose of Hazlitt's synesthesia is to reenact the habitual associations of flat retinal images with memories of touch, in order that an illusion of spatial reality can be experienced by a reader for whom the picture is absent, in the same way that a morning in ancient Greece is absent to a modern artist, or a sphere is absent to a man who has never touched one. In recognising the landscape through painting, Hazlitt shared with the philosophers of his day the erroneous assumption of Renaissance perspective, science, that the window of the picture plane is an adequate representation of our retinal image, or as James J. Gibson put it, the classical assumption that two-dimensional vision is immediate, primitive, or sensory, while three-dimensional vision is secondary, derived, or perceptual. Without the impressions made on one sense by another, Hazlitt believed he would not have felt he could interpret Wilson's paintings as convincing spatial illusions. Thus, when it came to Richard Wilson's treatment of comparatively novel subjects such as Cumberland or Westmoreland as part of the alternative Grand Tour of Britain, quote, however stupendous the scenery of that country is and however powerful and lasting the impression it must always make on the imagination, yet the effect is not produced merely through the eye of the spectator, it arises chiefly from collateral and associated feelings, unquote. Unless, that is, a scene is sufficiently time-honoured by resemblance to Claude or other old masters, the spectator will not be in possession of enough associations to project an illusion of solidity onto the flat canvas. In such a picture, quote, a mountain shrinks to a molehill, and the lake that expands its broad bosom to the sky seems hardly big enough to launch a fleet of cockle shells. Compared to Claude's painting of the Campagna, outside Rome, the spatial representation of unfamiliar English scenery has no more experiential conviction than a map of China on an inch of pasteboard. Hazlitt was aware that Molyneux's question was taken up and developed as the central tenet of Bishop Berkeley's New Theory of Vision of 1709, a work that became widely popular. But in seeming to endorse Locke's answer to Molyneux's question, Berkeley was entirely misunderstood by generations of commentators. For the New Theory of Vision was the prolegomena to his Principles of Human Knowledge, published 1 year later, which rejects matter and the material universe in its entirety. By pursuing empirical ideas of visual association to the point of collapse in the earlier work, Berkeley was preparing an account of consciousness vouchsafed by God instead of an external world. And whereas Locke intends to disprove the existence of innate complex sensations, Berkeley's concern is to deny that there can be a single or unitary object of sensation. He trenchantly maintained, therefore, that ideas of sight and touch, though habitually associated, have nothing in common either with each other or with a corporeal external world. In truth and strictness of speech, he writes, I neither see distance itself, nor anything that I take to be at a distance. From Berkeley's point of view, it's all supplied by God as a kind of television set in our minds. The commonsensical Hazlitt was no more convinced by Berkeley's position in the Principles, that all those bodies which compose the mighty frame of the world have not any subsistence without a mind, than he could accept Hume's sceptical hypothesis of a mind shut up in the narrow cell of its individuality. Yet where Kuyp at Dulwich Art Gallery was concerned, he was speculating